we can make a start. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. We're really delighted to welcome you all, and thank you for deciding to be present in this event that, for all of us presenting today, is the culmination of over 2 years of collective work, of collaboration. Myself and Tim, we initially conceived the idea of this anthology during the summer of 2018, and the book reached completion about a year ago. So we have been waiting very patiently until today, until it becomes available. The book for us stands as a real testament to the skill, rigor, intelligence, the love, the energy, the passion that many clinicians and many practitioners bring to this field. That is what really makes this field. The body of work in this book is wide, it's broad, it's deep, it's heartful, it's skillful, and it's a very big collective discussion that we hope will have many additions in the years ahead as the field really flourishes and unfolds. We have a few presenters with us today. Not all of our authors are present, but many of our dear authors are. And our structure today is not an easy task because we have many presentations we wanted to include in this space. How we're going to structure it is that each author will take 5 minutes to present an idea that they wish to bring to the collective space today. Some will speak to it and some will read from the book chapter. Our IPT administrator and tech goddess, as some of her know her as, will discuss the Q&A structure during the event and after the presentation. So Jess, it's over to you.
Hello, it's such an honor to be here with all of you. So for the Q&A, we're going to have 2 different formats. If you have questions while people are presenting, you can drop a question in the Q&A chat. And if you'll please note who you would like to answer your question, that will help us keep things ordered. And panelists can answer through that same chat box throughout the presentations. And then at the end, provided that we have enough time, and I think we will, we'll do a live Q&A where I will go to the Q&A chat box and read off questions as they come in and direct them towards the panelists they're addressed to.
So hello, I'm Tim. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to start with a few practicalities. Psychedelics and Psychotherapy, the publication date in the States is tomorrow, 5th of October. But it's not coming out in the UK until the 11th of November, held up a bit by the global supply chain issues. But it is out now on Kindle. Our publisher is Inner Traditions. And if you want to, you can find us on the Inner Traditions website, where there's a Browse Inside feature, where you can see the table of contents and the author biogs. You might want to do this because when we introduce our speakers, we're just going to be introducing them by name. We're not going to go into the detail of our experience. There's a discount code for Inner Traditions for those of you in the States, 15% discount code, which Jess is going to put on the chat. Psy, first 3 letters of psychedelics and the first 3 letters of psychotherapy. In the UK, it's going to be available from the usual outlets, including Hive, WH Smith, Book Depository, etc. And we thought the best price was from Hive. So Psychedelics and Psychotherapy is a multi-author book with 30 contributors. The chapters are a conversation about how to best work with psychedelic states, how to hold the work in a way that's therapeutic and healing. And as with most conversations, there are different voices and different perspectives in this book, the creative coming together that we hope is greater than the sum of its parts. Of course, no conversation is ever complete. There may be some important voices that are absent, but any good conversation carries momentum and goes on to inform other conversations. we have huge gratitude for those who've contributed to this volume and really honour their presence and the gifts that they offer. And our authors were chosen not only for their wisdom and expertise, but also especially for their human qualities, their heart, their essential decency, and the quality of their presence. So these are people that are really in dedicated service to fellow humans, to this work and to this field. And this book is indeed a labour of love. So whenever we work in psychedelic states, whether in ceremonies, retreats, or clinical research facilities, we offer an invitation to a kind of sacred place, a place of receptive opening, of gentleness, of compassion, of holding, of softly being together while we travel alongside each other in search of growth and wholeness. And we believe that this mindset is the fundamental requirement, the only way to work with psychedelic states. And we invite you all to join us in this spirit. So I'm going to go now to the introduction that Maria and I wrote together called Into the Deep. And the subheading is COVID-19, Microbe and Archetype. So Maria and I have been working on this bit for some years, but the time when we really got down to it, did the hard yards, was during the coronavirus pandemic of 2020. And for us as editors and for many of the contributors, this extraordinary period of isolation and lockdown was the time when we did much of the labour of creation. It's been a time of transformational potential, an opportunity for many of us to look within, maybe reflect on our lives, what truly matters and what needs to change. But it's been tough, and we suggest that the pandemic has held an archetypal intensity that has similarities to a challenging psychedelic experience. By archetype, we refer to the intensification of meaning, the universal principles, the primary colours, the unchanging platonic forms of our collective human experience. And the amplified meaning that developed during the pandemic included the quality of constriction, an encounter with death, and the emergence of shadow. The concept of shadow has an important role in this book. Shadow, of course, represents those parts of ourselves that we repress from our conscious awareness, our blind spots. And our blind spots play a surprisingly large part in the choices we make and the way we think we choose to live our lives. Psychedelic states help us to see more deeply into the psyche, and this process inevitably brings an encounter with shadow. So this process of opening our eyes to ourselves is a painful but necessary movement towards health and wholeness. Coronavirus may have brought us together in some ways as a global community, but also seems to have accelerated a collective opening to shadow. And we've been collectively challenged in the ways in which we see the world, learning maybe to question our history more, our conditioning, our attitudes, and the way we see each other. We've also been through a collective encounter with death, every single one of us. Some of us, it's a mild brush. For others, it's a deep immersion. The encounter with death and the death rebirth archetype is a very important part of our collective unconscious, as evidenced by the various resurrection myths. And it's also a frequent occurrence in psychedelic states, where it's often an opportunity for real change, for transformational change. And for some of us, this collective crisis will be a trigger that also activates other psychological wounds that lie deeply buried in our own individual unconscious, thus potentially making these wounds available for healing. And one of the main themes in this book is how to work with such material when it does come up so that healing really does occur rather than it just be another re-traumatization. Synchronicity is another important term that you will find in the book, and we suggest that there's a synchronicity between the coronavirus pandemic and the most crucial issue of our times. We cannot continue predating on Mother Earth. We need a fundamental restructuring of our relationship with her, moving from a predatory toddler position to a more responsible partnering position. And we imagined coronavirus emanating from Earth as a manifestation of the archetypal feminine in her darker regenerative form, appearing like a goddess, holding the world in her thrall. People fall before her. The engines of commerce are quietened. The oceans and skies are stilled, and the air has become clear and fresh, so our planet can take a breath. When psychedelics are used with an intentional mindset, the challenge is how not to return to how we were before. So if you're having a transformational experience, then the trick is to allow yourself to be properly transformed in a way that works. But the clarity that can arise in an expanded state can so easily slip away, and the work really lies in harvesting the fruits of the journey. And this is what we mean by integration. And this book really highlights the central importance of integration. Maybe there's also a synchronicity between the psychedelic renaissance and this urgent need to transform our relationship with the planet. The rebirth that we need to navigate together will require deep, collective inner work, courage, and time. And we all need to put our shoulders to this wheel. And we'd like to think that the type of transformational change that can follow best practice work of psychedelic states can be part of this change. And this book is an offering to this collective need. I would like to hand over now to Andrew Feldmar. So Andrew, I'd like to invite you to unmute yourself and speak.
Thank you very much. I'm Andrew Feldmar, and the first chapter in the book, the title is On the Therapeutic Stance During Psychedelic Psychotherapy. The idea that I want to spend a few minutes on exposing is what I find touches my heart most, is in the psychedelic renaissance that we are experiencing, I notice an unfortunate bias towards focusing on the substances, the psychedelics, the empathogenics, the drugs. And my nightmare is that very soon they are going to be just like antidepressants, or uppers and downers and this and that, and a medical model would take over, which would be disaster. Psychotherapy has nothing to do with medicine. Psychotherapy has nothing to do with psychology. It's a branch of what Aristotle called the practical sciences, and he named two, namely ethics and politics. Ethics being how we treat each other, and politics being the art of accruing and maintaining sufficient power to do what you want and not to do what you don't want. The greatest cause of unhappiness is powerlessness and allowing ourselves to treat others badly and allowing ourselves to be treated badly. Aristotle's first thesis on ethics wasn't about how to be good. It was written in order to be happy. Eudaimonia is the Greek word for happiness, and basically his thesis was that if we don't treat each other well, we'll never be happy. So psychedelic psychotherapy is about between, not within. R.D. Laing, who was my teacher, his major contribution, I think, was, and it's totally forgotten and marginalized, that there is no us and them. There is only us. The worst has happened to all of us, including therapists. And so the encounter, enhanced by a psychedelic, is between two human beings who probably desperately try to regain their full humanness in each other's company. The psychedelic itself is just part of the environment in which a meeting can take place. We flow in and through each other. We are not skin encapsulated egos. I am because we are. people who didn't have a community when they were growing up, there was no solidarity in the family, they would have trouble knowing who they are, because identity has a lot to do with belonging, with the us. I am because we are. So especially under the influence of a psychedelic, we definitely resonate with each other. We overcome the illusion that we are separate, and we slide down here where we are one. So the important thing in psychedelic psychotherapy is the person of the therapist, not the drug that is being administered. The drug is easy. The interpersonal interaction is what's difficult. My encounter with psychedelics started in 1967, and I have had many occasions to notice that in every encounter, there is a moment where it is a deeply interpersonal moment. Something like looking into each other's eyes and wondering whether, are you sure you don't mean any harm to me? So any therapist who is acting as a therapist and not being 100% unabashedly himself or herself can cause enormous confusion in the other. So it's a moment of truth for both the therapist and the patient. And my general experience is that either both get better or neither. It's not the therapist doing something to the patient. It's not the drug doing anything to anybody. The healing moment often is, I could kill you and I won't. Psychedelics usually render the patient or the patient and therapist, if the therapist also participates in the journey, very vulnerable, and your usual defenses don't work. So you become easy prey. And the healing moment is when the patient thinks the therapist could kill her or him. And the therapist doesn't. The therapist loves the patient, and the patient isn't surviving the encounter because he's so smart, because he's so well defended, but actually has a moment of conviviality, which is, I think, what we are together for. Lang used to say, why we are together? To have fun. And if we can't, all right, we'll have to get into it. Well, that's what I wanted to say. And now I want to introduce Rachel Harris, who is going to tell you about her ideas.
Okay, so I see how our chapters are related. My chapter is entitled Ayahuasca and Psychotherapy, and I want to clarify that I'm reading excerpts that are not during a ceremony or a journey. They're what might be called integration sessions, so everybody's straight. And so this is from the chapter, Rupture in the Therapeutic Process. Even with a history of drinking ayahuasca and a strong therapeutic alliance, it's inevitable that a glitch will occur in the therapist-client relationship. One or the other will feel misunderstood, diminished in some way, and possibly frustrated, disappointed, or upset with the other. This disconnection is called a rupture in the moment-to-moment relationship between therapist and client, and it usually means that one or the other's unconscious has been tweaked. It can be as small an interaction as, client, after an ayahuasca ceremony, said with awe, "The lights were incredible, like fireworks." Therapist, slightly impatient, "Yes, but what did you learn?" A better response from the therapist would have simply been, "Uh-huh," a neutral acknowledgement to allow the client to continue to share. But this particular therapist happens to value insight and achievement, and she wanted to get into the depth work immediately. Her timing was off, a very simple rupture. Client, startled by the abrupt shift, stutters, "I'm not sure, I just wanted to enjoy the beauty." Therapist, realizing she's out of step, "I'm sorry, I rushed you. Please go on." Client, accepting the repair, "Yes, the lights were different this time. I could feel them streaming into my body." The rupture was not only about timing, it was in the wrong modality. What did you learn requires a cognitive answer with linear thinking. Light streaming into a body comes from the shamanic realm, where miracles happen beyond explanation. Note the seamless shift from seeing the lights to the somatically based experience of feeling the lights enter the body. A therapist without ayahuasca experience might at best consider light streaming into a body to be a metaphor. A therapist with experience recognizes that this is a direct description of the process of healing. That's from the chapter. Then this is a more current conversation with someone, also not in ceremony, but another rupture. And the person is talking about a camping trip where she's sleeping in a sleeping bag with no tent on a mountainside. Right before dawn, I felt something approaching me. I had an overwhelming sense of primal fear. I didn't know whether I should move to see what it was or remain completely still. I turned my head just enough to see a huge cat, a jaguar. The cat scratched my thigh, through my jeans from hip to knee, one long scratch and two smaller ones. This is the kind of story that should not be interpreted psychologically. It should be heard in a wholly different way and held by the listener as a numinous event. These things happen, and they need to be recognized, protected, and received. The woman's name was Ariel, who was telling me this story. I told Ariel with certainty, this was an initiation. Now, the next section is my confession. When I said to Ariel that this is an initiation, I recognized this statement as coming through me, not from me. I hear this every once in a while in my voice. It's a voice with more certainty. It's authoritative and wise. Whereas I'm personally more agnostic, questioning, and well known for being outspoken, meaning I have a tendency to put my foot in my mouth. I do recognize the difference though, but I don't know whether the voice that comes through me is inspired by an outside source or by my inner wisdom, my higher self. Differentiating between inner and outer at this level is a philosophical dilemma and may not be important anyway. What's important is that I listen to myself when I hear this quality in my voice, and other people seem to respond. However, I also had my own egotistical response to Ariel's story, separate from this wise voice and more in the category of foot and mouth. I don't think we have jaguars in North America, I told her. Need I mention that I know nothing about big cat wildlife on any continent? And I was confused, as many are evidently, since I researched the question of identifying big cats on the internet. What's the difference between a jaguar, puma, mountain lion? Who cares? Totally irrelevant for Ariel's amazing story. But there I was, stuck in my editorial ego, trying to clarify an animal species. The good news is I didn't pursue this line of questioning, which would have totally distracted Ariel from her experience. I caught myself and didn't indulge my ego. I wish I could say I do that all the time, but a numinous experience should be left untouched, honored, and respected from afar. It has its own way of working through a person, healing and changing them as the experience deepens and moves through their inner life. This is why a psychedelic guide or therapist has to have their own experiences in these other realms, inner and outer, to know when to sit in silence and just be present to the whole mysterious unfolding. So I'd like to introduce my dear friend, Jerome Braun. I could say a lot about him, but I won't. And here's Jerome.
Rachel, thank you very much. And thank you, Tim and Maria, for putting together this incredible collection of really wise and guiding information for this burgeoning field that we're in. Thank you very much. Yes, my name is Jerome Braun, and I also go by Jerónimo. I'm bilingual in Spanish and English, and I have contributed the chapter called Impact of Personal Psychedelic Experience in Clinical Practice. The chapter focuses on the experience of the psychotherapist and the breadth and depth and height of what the therapist knows, and their paradigm directly impacts the amount of space, if I could say it that way, the spaciousness that allows for the client then also to be able to experience, whether it's integration, disintegration, dysregulation, as Jung called it, to be able to have that safety, to be able to work with that in the post psychedelic session. The chapter also moves beyond just our collective reality, our collective cultural consciousness that is based in rational, empirical, and I'm afraid to say biomedical biases around these psychedelic medicines, which I agree with Andrew that we have a tricky razor's edge right now of making these medicines too literal and too concrete, and just making it just a substance that we're integrating into the body, rather than what is actually just a portal that opens so that we can actually be able to have access to what I call the superior intelligences. I'm a Jungian psychoanalyst trained at the C.G. Jung Institute in Küstach, Zurich in Switzerland. And I've also been intricately involved with indigenous healers, Shipibo healers, in the Peruvian Amazon. Their names are Maestro Nelson, Maestra Anita, and Maestro Javier. And I have great gratitude to them for opening up and sharing. And it's the combination of Jung's concepts with the wisdom that comes from these indigenous Shipibo people that I bring to the psychotherapy that I work with in my practice, and which is what I've written about just briefly in the chapter. And the training that they're giving me is not so much about just the psychedelic ayahuasca chakaruna ceremonies, but more into the superior intelligence that come through by working with the plants and the trees, which can then come into actually being the support and help to our clients. There's an overlap of Jungian psychology, which I think is incredibly helpful to give an internal map for the therapist in order to be able to navigate some of these very unfamiliar territories to our collective culture. Some of the concepts that I've just mentioned very briefly here would be that there is symbols are living symbols. They're not just things that represent something else. Complexes, the ego self access, the psychoid reality, the reality of the imaginal space, entities that actually can inform us and we can be in communication with, and the numinous. Also, what gives us maybe some guidance through the Jungian psychology is that how to be in relationship, genuine opening to these superior intelligences, enhancing what happens and informs us during the psychotherapy session. These medicines also can help us to learn that we're not doing something as therapists to the client, but maybe it's more like what the Shipibo healers are treating their clients, their patients with. They're moving into a vibrational space, which then helps the patient move into a vibrational space for healing and being able to learn more about themselves. So that's a brief nutshell of the chapter. And now I have the pleasure to be able to introduce Dr. Scott Hill.
Thank you, Jerome. Yes, my name is Scott Hill. Hi, all. I don't remember the title of my chapter. It's chapter 5 and begins with the word daimonic, and perhaps Tim or Maria can write the title of the chapter in the chat box. It concerns Jungian insights into trauma in treating trauma in psychedelic psychotherapy, and that's Jungian as in Carl Jung, as Jerome referred to. Okay, because my chapter stems from my own traumatic, yet ultimately life-enhancing psychedelic experiences, I'm going to give you a very brief personal introduction. In 1967, at the age of 19, after several ecstatic psychedelic induced revelations of the natural world's numinous beauty, my reckless recreational use of LSD led me into incomprehensibly dark realms of madness and terror. I spent most of my life trying to understand and come to terms with those traumatic trips. And I have come to see them, in some respects anyway, as a 19-year-old's psychedelic version, a kind of flashback experience, if you will, of the third-degree burns I suffered as a 2-year-old boy. The phase of integrating those experiences that is most relevant to the contributions I made to this volume was my immersion in the psychology of Carl Jung. Very generally, Jung's psychology illuminates brilliantly why one's psychedelic-induced encounter with the irrational and mystical depths of the collective or archetypal unconscious can be terrifying. Even when that encounter does not awaken past trauma. But focusing on past trauma that arises in psychedelic experience, the relevance of Jung's psychology became especially obvious to me when I discovered the work of Jungian analyst Donald Kalsched, in particular his book, The Inner World of Trauma, Archetypal Defenses of the Personal Spirit. Kalsched discusses there the unconscious images revealed in the dreams of his adult patients who have suffered traumatic childhood trauma. As it turns out, the dreams of Kalsched's patients consistently reveal disturbing images, such as powerful, threatening figures that are remarkably similar to images encountered by some people during difficult psychedelic experiences. Kalsched's trauma model, what he calls the psyche's archetypal self-care system, relies on Jung's approach to trauma-induced dissociation and the psychological complexes that arise out of dissociation. Of course, we've known ever since Sandoz Pharmaceuticals research in the 1940s that psychedelics can reveal unconscious trauma. But through Kalsched's and Jung's work, I came to more fully appreciate the psychological dynamics underlying the manifestation of trauma. That is, I came to more fully appreciate the way past trauma can manifest in a psychedelic experience. The essence of what a Jungian perspective offers us is that no matter how chaotic or bizarre the content of a person's psychedelic experience may appear, it could very well reveal past trauma. And proper attention to this apparently bizarre content, in combination with the therapist's understanding of the psychological dynamics underlying this content, can reveal a meaning that can help bring about healing. I don't mean to suggest that every disturbing image that arises in a psychedelic experience can be understood in terms of Kalsched's archetypal self-care system. Far from it. But when such imagery does arise, Jung's and Kalsched's work provides a fruitful line of inquiry into the possibility of underlying trauma and provides a useful approach to treating trauma that manifest in such imagery. Thank you. Now I'd like to turn it over to Ingrid Pacey. Ingrid, it's all yours.
Well, good morning from my side of the world. And my thanks too to Maria and Tim, and my pleasure in being able to express and put out what my own experience has been in working with expanded states of consciousness. My chapter is called Holotropic Breathwork and MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for trauma survivors. And I write from the perspective of a psychiatrist who worked for with conventional psychotherapy, sitting in my office, using medication at times, and realizing that you could get so far and then things stopped. Like how to really shift the internalized pain, the painful relationships, the depression, the anxiety, all of the reasons why some of these people came to therapy without really knowing that there had been, other issues in their lives. So in my searching for a more effective method to work with these people, I explored experiential therapies, art therapy, many other modalities. And then in the late 80s, had my first experience. Stan Grof was coming to work in British Columbia, and I had my first experience with holotropic breath work, which really was mind-blowing, and you could see the opening that was possible. And then I entered my training program with Stan and Christina. And what I could see with that is what starts to happen if you actually are with a patient in this, or a client, in this completely different format, where you can sit next to them, there can be physical touch, and the whole opening of their history and their pain happens in this much more supported, heartfelt, and intimate environment. And so I was very pleased to be able to use that and move into starting to introduce that to patients from my own practice. And then I received referrals also. So then I did almost 15 years of doing monthly holotropic breathwork practices in Vancouver, till my partner got burnt out and there was a struggle to find out who else to work with. And by then I was in my 60s, and so things slowed down. In fact, people joke that we had this golden period of holotropic breathwork in Vancouver. But also in my training, I happened to be in the same training group as Rick Doblin. And as you all know, Rick has, been like a dog with a bone in his teeth to really push forward the issue of psychedelics as therapeutic agents. And so, eventually at a reunion, he spoke to me about the plans he had for MDMA. And at that point, Andrew and I got to know each other more. And we really started looking at the possibility of MDMA research in Vancouver. And after, you can imagine, periods of struggle with Health Canada, the training program happened. And of course, there was another whole level of revelation of what happens then when a substance is introduced into the psychotherapeutic field. And my experience with breathwork, I felt I had all the tools I needed to be able to work with people in altered states of consciousness, and with this other method with the drug-enhanced therapeutic session. As Andrew and Jerome mentioned, the whole issue of the therapy being a pivotal part of the encounter, that it is not just the medication, is being critical. And so I've been very much a proponent of us talking about MDMA or psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, that it is not really psychedelic therapy or MDMA therapy, that the psychotherapy and the follow-up and the integration, like it's the whole package that has to be, the important piece. And now I hear psychiatrists saying to me, when I've spoken about them sitting in their offices, working with people with trauma histories, and then feeling like there's no place else to go. And so I'm so happy that there really is a growing growth within the psychiatry to look at these other possibilities for people that have been sitting across a desk from somebody and really being stuck in the place where they are. So I too am very pleased that all that everyone's written is coming together to really provide a grounded place from which other people can learn about the importance and the possibilities of working with psychedelics. Thank you. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Jo Riley.
Thanks very much, Ingrid. The chapter I wrote together with Tim is called Therapeutic Use of MDMA for Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder. It follows on nicely from yours, I think, Ingrid, Recovering the Lost Good Objects. My background is in psychiatry and psychoanalysis. I work in an NHS psychodynamic psychotherapy service here in the UK. And I think it's probably fair to say that most of the patients I see have experienced childhood trauma, loss, usually abuse. And I'm very aware of how difficult it is to engage in therapy when there are these histories of early complex developmental trauma. This is partly because it's so challenging to develop a trusting relationship with those in positions of providing care, supposedly, when you've experienced abuse or not been adequately protected by those who are meant to keep you safe. And also because difficulties in symbolization, so commonly seen in complex trauma, means that the trauma has not been possible to articulate or to think about sufficiently, which are essential processes if you're going to securely locate the trauma in the past. Getting close to it in therapy then runs the very real risk of terrifyingly re-experiencing the trauma in the present, along with all the associated feelings such as fear, shame, terrifying helplessness, and symptoms such as flashbacks and dissociation. The present in the therapy session becomes flooded with the trauma of the past. Given these difficulties, it seemed intuitively to me to make sense that a substance which increases the capacity to trust and for self-compassion has the potential to be helpful in these situations. Trauma and therapy and healing all occur in the context of intensely meaningful relationships with others. I was drawn to the MAPS model, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, which has led to this so far, to the research trials for this treatment, for its explicit focus on the psychological model and the therapy, emphasizing the importance of the therapeutic relationship as holding the potential for transformational change. The MDMA in this work is seen as the catalyst for change and growth within the containment provided by the setting and the therapeutic stance, not as being the curative factor as a medicine in itself. It supports and enables the therapeutic process that happens through a human-to-human, person-to-person domain. In the chapter that we wrote, Tim and I described the importance of this containment that the therapy pairs provide, the powerful impact of working with a parental dyad in this work, and how this may activate early attachment patterns, which often go alongside complex developmental trauma. Our internal object relations, a psychoanalytic term, refers to the internalized formative relationships that we all carry inside us. They're unconscious and they form the basis of how we relate to ourselves and the external world. After traumatic experiences, our internalized good objects are exposed as inadequate at best and malign at worst, failing in their basic task of keeping you safe. And the loss of these essential supportive structures in the psyche can make it almost impossible to find any faith or belief that you can be helped by a supposedly trusted other, or that you have the necessary internal resource in oneself to face the unbearable which has happened and attempt to come to terms with it. MDMA's empathogenic effects on the brain provide a temporary biochemical solution which can support a powerful therapeutic engagement as a start to allowing something of the lost good object to be regained. The quality of the therapist's attunement and their capacity to hold and to contain the terrified state of mind and the traumatic material is then crucial in allowing the experiences to be addressed and thought about, put into words, symbolized, meaning the trauma can start to take its rightful place as an experience which belongs in the past and no longer control the present quite so powerfully. With the support of the recovered good objects, a process of mourning can follow, mourning for what has been lost because of the traumatic experience, and for the untraumatized self, who you were before, and how this has been fundamentally changed, and what can be recovered of yourself from before the events happened. Therapist training and supervision, so the container is contained, are also essential parts of this process. As with all treatments, there are potential side effects and enactments which therapists can get caught up in, especially when working with highly sensitized, highly vulnerable states of mind. And I also welcome that these issues are taken very seriously within this model. I hope Tim and I have captured some of these, I think, very precious and helpful ideas and done them justice in our chapter. And it's now my pleasure to hand over to Svea Nielsen. Thank you.
If Svea is not ready, we can move on to the next person and then get back to her towards the end if she's back. So the next person will be John Ablett.
My chapter is about using mandalas to integrate experiences in expanded states of awareness. There's some very complex and detailed mandalas in the book, but a mandala doesn't have to be detailed or complicated, and you don't have to be an artist in order to work with one. The mandala just needs to connect imaginatively and emotionally with something important from the session. This mandala, which hopefully you can see, it's in focus, is a simple yellow circle. It reminds me of when I was a child and I used to rub my eyes before going to sleep at night, and I'd watch the bright yellow circles that formed when you stimulate the optic nerve, and they would just kind of lull me to sleep. This one is actually from a holotropic breathwork session in Spain. So if you will, I'd like you all to imagine that we are in a sharing circle. We are meeting at the end of a long day's inner journeying, and I have brought my mandala in order to tell my story, the story of my session. So in my session, I'm a teenager. I'm sitting with my mum at her bedside, and she's slowly dying of cancer. This is how it actually was. And she's hallucinating on morphine. She asked me to bring her favorite pudding, which is pineapple rings. And when I do that, she asked me to get her some tissue. And she whispers to me, "I want to make it nice for your father." And I watch in horror as she carefully spreads out the tissue. She puts the pineapple rings into the tissue, and then she slowly wraps them up and she spoons the juice onto the tissue. And as a teenager, I'm in absolute horror because I know this is something that's really, really important to her, but I don't know what to do. I don't know how to respond to it. In my session, as I'm reliving this, my mum is looking from the pineapple rings back to me, back to me, back to the pineapple rings. And I realize that she's telling me a wordless story. And the story that I intuit is that there are two children. She wants to wrap them both up in her love. One of the children, one of the pineapple rings, is me, and the other is a wet, sticky mess. It's a stillborn child. At the same time, she is telling me that she only had another child. She only had me because she wanted to make it nice for my father. And she is also saying that she didn't tell anyone because this was a horrible mess and she just wanted it to be nice. The first time I shared this story, it was in a seafront hotel. There are some rocks outside the workshop venue. So I came with my mandala, and a freak wave came up from the rocks, completely drenched my picture. I ran back inside to get some tissues to cover it. And suddenly I saw the halo of my mother's love shining back through the tissue, exactly as I'd seen it about 30 years earlier. So this is the story. A mandala just needs to connect with something imaginatively and emotionally important. The meaning of an image is your relationship to it. The meaning of the pineapple ring that we've just talked about here is a definition that you will not find in a dictionary of symbols anywhere. It includes the memories that it evokes, the process of embodying and integrating those feelings, and the act of retelling and reframing your story through it. That is my sharing. Thank you for listening.
John, should we pass back to Svea? I think Svea is...
Oh, brilliant. Okay, yes, thank you.
Thank you, John.
Hello, everyone. Sorry, I missed it before. So I'm speaking to you from Switzerland. Do you hear me well? Yes, okay. So my chapter in the book is about the sacred wood of Gabon, which we call it Iboga. And I just want to say how this special plant is making actually the integration part quite important. So for those who don't know about it, it's a root, and we use the bark of the root. So it's a very hidden plant, and it's called the medicine of the ancestors. It's really a plant and it's used by the pygmies in Gabon. So very, very small origin and very hidden plant. And it has been discovered in the 60s by Howard Lotsof, who was a polytoxicoman, and he used it like any other drug. And then he woke up 2 days after, and he had no more heroin addiction. So yes, it's a plant who chose the margin, first the pygmies and then the people with addiction. And it's also a plant which is, which can be lethal actually. So we have to really have a good heart to do it. So that's why it's really a plant which has some properties that are a bit different. And I've been trained to use it in Mexico with Claire Wilkins, and then in Chile. And now in Europe, there is one clinic who is doing it in Portugal. And this clinic is sending us the people to prepare and to integrate the work. And this plant is really something, well, the ceremony lasts 3 days, and it's very deep, and it's very deep process. And after that, it's something we can say about all psychedelics, but with this one, there is really like a physical also reset. And so people are a bit like newborn babies. And this is why in the chapter I was writing, I had a wish at the end of the chapter, and now I can say that this wish is starting to be realized, is to have integration farms. Because when the people are going out of these ceremonies, it's not possible for them to go back home. It's really not, because they really need a new container with a lot of the things that were said in the first presentation today that I really liked. Like we need community, we need nature, we need proper food, we need a lot of things that most of the people, not all, but especially the people with addiction, they don't find this home. So they need after the ceremony to be able to go to a place where they can totally reinvent themselves, where they are not put again in the same boxes or frames by the family or the partners. And so now it's been a few months in Switzerland that we started to welcome people that are going to this clinic in Portugal. And then they come here, and then we have a few farms with whom we are collaborating. And it's really interesting because it's making the integration part much longer than what we are used to, because we advise for at least a month, and sometimes they stay 3 months, and we have different ways. Of course, in the beginning, they need to pay a normal amount because they won't be asked to do anything special except, I don't know, recover, rest, and go to the hot bath and hiking and playing, and really like a nice environment really for them. But for some people who wants to stay longer and who don't have the money, we also try to have farms that accept people like roofing style. So they would pay only for the food, and then they are lodged and they would work for 4 hours a day. And this is also very interesting because, of course, it's part of the process of recovery and integration to feel that we are, to feel the satisfaction of giving back actually and work in the farm. And it's a lot of interactions also that are then new and that we can learn again to be in an interaction with a lot of people. So yes, this is something I really had in my heart for many years, and I'm really happy that now it's happening. And with the Boga again, it's really, really super important, because sending someone home after such a treatment is like really not respecting the plant itself, really not respecting even the person who came and really has a lot of hope, but then needs a container to really be able to unfold this new personality, and especially again the community really feel able to be in contact with nice, more or less healthy, everybody's not so healthy always, but like people, and build new relationships. So yes, I think this is what I really wanted to share with you tonight. And I really, another thing is that, of course, my dream is then that, because a lot of clients are coming from England, actually, so it would be really nice to have this network of farms also in England. So when people also have children or they cannot stay so long here, we can send them there in England, and also have these little networks of farms where they can have an integration stay. So it's a little call for the English people. Okay, I think I have finished for tonight.
Thank you very much. And after you, it's Nir Tadmor.
Hi, everyone. I'm really glad to be here, and thank you again, Maria and Tim. I wrote a chapter that is titled Harm Reduction, Peer Support, and the First Steps of Integration. And I'm basically describing two kind of major acute psychedelic crises that we supported together with a team I established and trained in Israel. Our project is called Safe Shore, and we basically establish safe spaces in parties and festivals. And in the chapter, I describe one experience which I can describe as a very powerful spiritual emergence, where someone arrived to our space really experiencing a messianic revelation full on with all the cells of his body. And I describe kind of how we supported this process and how we helped him land back and kind of accompany him in the first steps of integration. And another story I share there is a story where we supported a soldier that had a very painful and traumatic experience a few months before we met him in the party. And I kind of describe how we supported him as well. And something I didn't share in the chapter, and I kind of wanted to share here in this very kind of short time frame, is kind of the basic principles that kind of MAPS and the Zendo project, which they laid on paper. So basically the main aspect of our work, and that's the first principle, is creating a safe space. And creating a safe space obviously has many aspects to it. But I wanted to kind of share just some examples from how we kind of apply this principle in the field. So of course, first of all, we have to take care of the physical health of people where they arrive, not because we're medical professionals, but because there is a medical team in the event, and we are many times the ones that need to assess if to turn to the medical team or not. And something that we are aware of, and sometimes the medical team is not, and it's kind of a very, I think, important example on how like a psychedelic harm reduction team can actually contribute to medical interventions, is, for example, the situation where people can become hyponatremic under the influence of MDMA, because one of the metabolites of MDMA signals the kidneys to retain fluids, but people are dancing and they're drinking and their mouth is dry because of all the serotonin, and they're drinking a lot, but they're not taking any urine out. And sometimes it can really lead to hospitalizations and even death cases. And this can be prevented pretty simply by taking electrolytes before, by turning to medical assistance as soon as you have really, like, as soon as you feel disoriented, or when your friends notice that you're disoriented, because this is usually the first stage of hyponatremia. It can be really like strong headaches, which we're aware of and should not be a part of MDMA use. And we already heard stories about people arriving to hospitals in London, actually, and spending a few hours in intensive care without the medical team actually realizing that they're hyponatremic, which I think should be checked pretty early in the intervention when we realize the person took MDMA. So just a small example of like an information we can bring when we escort someone to medical assistance. The second principle is sit, do not guide. And I think this one is also, it's really, really important and can also be implemented in psychotherapy, in early intervention, in psychosis, in mental hospitals. And I think actually, this whole field of psychedelic harm reduction and this whole field work that we're doing, I think can be, like, there's many insights and lessons and tools that can be extracted from this work and applied in mental hospitals, especially to treat people who are having psychotic episodes. And I think that the approach that we bring to psychedelic harm reduction could be hugely beneficial for people that work in people that go through psychotic episodes. And I spent a few years working as a mental health guide in alternatives to psychiatric hospitalizations, kind of more private centers, and I could see these principles kind of working. So yeah, I can hear the bell. So I will just say maybe about the third principle very shortly, that it's called talk through, not down, which is something that I kind of described in the chapter as well, of how we just allow the contents that emerge, whether it's a really powerful messianic experience or anything else. We just give space and support and confidence that whatever you want to express is welcomed here and it's safe to express it here. And the last principle is just that difficult is not the same as bad. And I think this is very clear for all of us here, but it's still something that's important to remember. And kind of this title of a bad trip sometimes kind of minimizes the opportunity to actually transform a difficult experience to a meaningful and healing one. Thank you.
So yes, my name is Leor Roseman. I'm a neuroscientist by training. I work in the psychedelic research at the Center for Psychedelic Research in Imperial College London for 8.5 years already, with Roberta Murphy and David Nutt. And my chapter is called Psychedelic Peace Building, Relational Processes in Ayahuasca Rituals of Palestinians and Israelis. So after a few years doing psychedelic therapy, working in psychedelic therapy research and neuroscience, kind of wanted to investigate the relational process of what Andrew Feldmar said, the in-between. And this is my own personal curiosity, and my own personal journeys were a lot about these. And obviously our life and the contextual elements of our suffering is not just the inner work, as Andrew mentioned, and I was curious about relational processes. For example, trauma and alienation are relational as well. So I assume that healing should be relational as well. So as an Israeli, I kind of said, okay, I need a relational problem. There's the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Let's go investigate this. I teamed up with Natalie Ginsberg from MAPS and Antoine Saka, who's a Palestinian peace activist. And we went to a road trip interviewing Israelis and Palestinians. We drink ayahuasca together in different contexts, usually a regular practice that kind of forms community. And a few themes emerged from these. And can you hear me well? Yeah.
It comes in and out, the sound. Sometimes it sounds well and sometimes it goes quite low.
So maybe if I hold it here, is that better? Okay, cool. So in the book chapter, I tried to connect those themes from the interviews we did into psychedelic therapy and how they apply to psychedelic therapy. For example, there were themes about human connection and about recognition of the other, about acceptance, about I-thou relationships. And all of these I connected to psychedelic therapy, the therapeutic alliance, to the importance of human relationships as part of the psychedelic therapy. But I'm going to kind of expand now on maybe the most provocative theme. And this is about prophetic processes of prophetic revelations. But I'll start with something easier, okay, with collective traumas. So many of our interviewees reported having strong collective traumas, visions, insights of collective traumas. These can be from the army service, the Holocaust, the Nakba, which is the deportation of many Palestinians from their homes in 48, the bleeding land, the suffering of the bleeding land. Actually, few Palestinian women felt the pain of the land itself, and sometimes people saw visions of themselves as the other in the conflict. So Israeli envisioning him as a Palestinian feel that pain. A lot of times those visions, those insights came from and were triggered by the context, by sharing the space with the other. But what I would like to kind of mention, and what I found myself becoming more and more attracted, is something that happened to few of those who had those revelations after. And immediately after the vision, few of those participants tried to deliver some message. Okay, and this is what I would call a prophetic process. At the moment, they try to deliver some message, whether it's by a song or in other means. So they were ignited by anger or guilt or a crisis or some separation from the group, but then they carry some universal message of freedom or equality, of love to the group. But still there's a force in it, a force of anger that's kind of behind it. So if we look at the mystical union, the archetypical mystical union is an experience about ego dissolution, oneness. It's beyond good and bad, beyond time and space. It is without morality. The prophetic process, or the archetypical prophetic process, is a process on the stage of history. So the person sees himself suddenly as an actor of the same stage of history. There's time, space. There is morality. There's good and bad. There's action. And unlike acceptance of the mystical union, there's also maybe an energy of resistance and an energy of anger and an energy of change, of action. So there's sometimes those tensions between, and many scholars, whether peace scholars or scholars of mystical experiences and mystical practices, say that there's sometimes tension between the mystical union, the feeling of oneness, and the mystical liberation. And liberation is a more political kind of orientation, political orientation, which is also has some social criticism behind it. So I would like to say that sometimes therapists also can see these processes happening to patients. Sometimes we might even call them messianic ruptures. But we need to learn how to work with these energies in order to bring social change, because they are about social change or ecological change. So therapists can learn how to integrate the psychedelic ignited sense of mission into positive social change. It's about learning how to work with impulsivity and what looks like impulsivity in the moment, but not necessarily denying it completely before day-to-day tensions are reintroducing doubt. We need to mark that moment of certainty and learn how to work with it. Integrating prophetic revelations is not just by words and sense-making, but first of all, it is by action. So finding the right action that will follow those moments of rupture is part of the integration. So I hope you will be able to recognize those moments in your practice and with your clients and patients, and find ways of working with them in order to bring a better reality. Thank you very much. And now, Becca Tarnas.
Thank you, Leor. It's an honor to be part of this book, and thank you, Maria and Tim, for the invitation to contribute. My chapter is focused on a specific esoteric method or tool that can be used for psychedelic integration. And the chapter is titled Celestial Integration, Psychedelics and Archetypal Astrology. And one major facet of my work is as a counseling archetypal astrologer. And I came to this work as a second generation astrologer. So I was introduced to my craft through my father, Richard Tarnas, and some of the core of this chapter is dipping into some ancient history, going back to Esalen Institute in Big Sur, where in the 1970s, Stan Grof was the scholar in residence at the time. And Rick Tarnas came to work with him as a doctoral student. And they set their minds to the one problem that had been coming up and puzzling researchers around how to predict the kind of experience that someone would have with a psychedelic medicine. And trying many different tests, psychological aptitude tests, the Rorschach test, they couldn't figure out one good way to really understand the kind of experience someone would have. There's such variability of experience, even when the setting is controlled, repeated, and so forth. And one day, a seminarian came to Esalen to go to one of their workshops. And he was an artist named Arne Tredevick. And he asked them, have you ever tried transit astrology? And being well educated within the Western scientific tradition, they were, of course, extremely skeptical of astrology, but figured at this point they may as well try it. And so Arne Tredevick taught them the basics of how to calculate birth charts, transits, which is where the planets are at any given moment in time, and how they relate to each other, how they relate to the birth chart. And once they learned these basic techniques, they came to realize with great surprise that this method could give them an archetypal picture of the kind of experience someone would have based on their transits at the time of the session, and also based on the configuration of the natal chart. And when they compared their personal records and the records of other patients working with psychedelics, they were amazed at how these correlations lined up. So as Stan Grof said, they had stumbled across a method that was even more controversial than the psychedelics themselves, astrology. And the focus of this chapter is not so much on prediction, although we can get a glimpse looking forward at the kind of experience someone might have, but also integration, using the language of astrology to understand what one has experienced, to gain a larger archetypal picture on that. And I have found this method to be extremely helpful in my own personal work. And I weave a little bit of that personal narrative into the chapter, and working with my astrology clients as well, those who come to me wanting to integrate a psychedelic experience. I just want to conclude what I'm saying by sharing the last paragraph of the chapter. And so what I wrote was, if the client is new to astrology, the revelation that there are correlations between one's innermost psychedelic experiences and the movement of the planets through the solar system can have a profoundly transformative effect on one's worldview. Astrology undermines the materialistic scientific paradigm because it demonstrates that there are other forms of causality beyond material and efficient mechanisms. When paired with astrological correlations, psychedelics have the potential to shatter all belief that we live in a random, meaningless, indifferent cosmos in which conscious human beings are a strange and lonely anomaly. Rather, they provide tangible and experiential evidence that we are in a universe saturated with meaning, numinosity, and divinity, and that through all of our experiences, even those of deep existential despair and suffering, we are being witnessed and mirrored by the great archetypal movements of the cosmos. So I'm now going to introduce Chris Bache, which I'm especially delighted to do as he's been one of my most influential teachers.
Thank you, Becca. It's a pleasure to be here with everybody, an honor to be with you today. For my contribution to this gathering, I'd like to read an excerpt from my essay, my contribution to the book, The Challenges of Integrating an Extreme Psychedelic Journey. In this essay, I reflect on my 20-year psychedelic journey reported in my book, LSD in the Mind of the Universe. And I want to say up front that I'm not a therapist. I am an academic trained in philosophy of religion. My psychedelic journey, therefore, was not primarily aimed at healing, though much healing took place, but at exploring the deep structure of the universe. Beginning in 1979, when I was a young academic, I did 73 high-dose LSD sessions following Stan Groff's protocol. Now, I don't recommend such an intense protocol today. If I were doing this journey over again, I would be gentler on myself. And yet, I'm also deeply grateful for having taken this journey. So here is the reading from that chapter. The psychedelic agents we have access to today are so powerful that they mark a new frontier in human experience. We can shatter the shell of our earthbound mind so consistently, grind our physical existence to dust so completely, that it becomes hard to describe the depths of cosmic communion that follow. By taking our life to its limits and repeatedly shattering those limits, we dissolve for hours at a time into flows of life that transcend all measures. By entering these states with focus and clear intent, by submitting to the harsh demands of death and rebirth, we surrender all we have been to become something utterly new. A being who can do things we could never do, know things we could never know. A being who breathes time, who dances in the stratosphere of planetary consciousness, who dissolves into the one that cradles all. As we enter larger and older levels of existence, the universe receives us and tutors us. It rewards our tenacity and perhaps foolhardy courage with exquisite intimacies, drawing us into almost unspeakable ecstasies of discovery. I think we are still in the early stages of understanding how entering these extreme states of consciousness is affecting us. What does it do to a person to hold the kind of memories I am holding? As long as our sessions stay close to the shoreline of the known world, uncovering the pains of our past, we have therapeutic models for working with them. When we travel a bit farther out to experience the intelligence running through all things and the continuity of life after death, we have spiritual models for absorbing these insights. But when our journeys take us great distances from the known world, when we enter the truly deep waters of the universe, how are these adventures being integrated by us then? What does integration even mean in this context? How does a finite being, exquisitely tuned to the conditions of space-time, digest our forays into the infinite? How does a time-bound being absorb excursions into deep time? What is the residual impact of merging with all of existence after we have returned to being just one among many? How does our day-to-day self manage such extreme fluctuations of the membrane of consciousness, not just once or twice, but 40, 50, 60 times. I am asking more questions than I have answers for. My life has become a living experiment in these matters, with the outcome still being determined. Thank you. And now I pass the baton to Renne Harvey.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks again to Maria and Tim for pulling this together, and it's wonderful to be part of this. My chapter covers elements of what is recommended for good psychedelic training, training of therapists. And I'm going to sweep over some of these to get to what I think of as the most important part, which I'll deal with at the end. I think most good programs have a process of selecting people, and it's a good way to start with the selection of people with some of the basic characteristics that are really necessary for this work. In the chapter, I follow the work of Janice Phelps on this, her wonderful paper published in 2017. And she outlines the characteristics, including therapists having an empathic, abiding presence, being able to instill trust in people, come to this work with a high level of integrity. And people really need to have done a lot of work on themselves. They need to have undergone therapy. They need to have dealt with their own shadow aspects. They need to have examined why they're doing this work, what's brought them to this. Are they doing it for their ego advancement or from a position of inflation? And they need to generally have an attitude of openness and willingness to learn, a great deal of flexibility. So in a good training course, you then would start with some good intellectual knowledge, going over the basics of what the medicines are, pharmacology, understanding history, cultural connections, understanding research models, outcomes. The chapter describes the aspect of clinical application, knowing how to assess and screen people, knowing how to look out for risks, doing a risk assessment management, using supervision, maintaining work with your own interpersonal dynamic issues in the therapy relationship, boundaries, basic knowledge around setting up therapy, set and setting, attending to people's physical needs, prep sessions, conducting the dosing session, doing an integration session. There's an awful lot to cover. And here we come to the bit that I think is very, very important for this work. And that is the integration of the therapy that we do with a broader perspective. Most of us as therapists have only really dealt with some aspects of what's needed in this work. And I, for example, didn't have any training in somatic approaches. Sometimes therapy covers, your training involves immersing yourself in certain models. And here you really need to expand your way of thinking and incorporate different models. So some of the therapies that you come with, that you bring to this, would be appropriate for using in follow-up. For example, acceptance and commitment therapy, internal family systems, Jungian work. And I think the important thing is for therapists to be willing to expand and, learn more of these ways of thinking, broaden their perspective. One of the most important expansions for most therapists is working with the transpersonal, spiritual and mystical elements. We know how important these are for creating change, for giving people the opportunity to experience deep transformation within themselves. And with this, for therapists, it's about doing this personal work for themselves. It's about continuing your own journey, doing your own deep inner work, and the willingness to involve your whole self in the process, a recognition that you're working with somebody with them. It's a process that has to touch you personally and change you in the process too, if it's going to be meaningful. I think also, finally, the importance of real practical training in how to do this work. Experiential work with other therapists, watching therapists working, doing role plays, modeling, getting feedback, and mentoring. it can't just be an intellectual process. And I know personally I've learned the most by watching other therapists work. I think I'm going to just leave it there. Thank you. And I hand over to Michelle Baker-Jones.
Hi, Renne, thank you so much. And lovely to see you. Renne was in the supervision group that I'm going to talk about. Really, I'm just introducing the chapter that many people have collaborated on. The section of the book is called Psychedelics, Psychotherapy, Supervision, Shared Learning, and Reflective Space. And the co-authors are, well, and in fact, Tim Reed was our supervisor on the Psylodep 2 trial, in which, yeah, we really would have been quite lost at sea without that supervision. So Tim Reed has contributed, Sven Kimani, Johnny Martell, Roberta Murphy, Ashley Murphy-Biner, and Rosalind Watts, and myself. So thinking about supervision, it's an integral part of any psychotherapy practice, offering a safe, reflective space where the complexity of the work can be unpacked and processed. So I'm going to just read a vignette that I've contributed to this section, and hopefully it will just help give a flavor of the work for you. And it's called Hostility in the Countertransference. So I was aware that I had a hostile reaction to Simon, experiencing him as misogynistic, contemptuous, and addressing everything to my male co-therapist. I was not sure that I could work with him. I took this to supervision, as it's unusual for me to have such a strong reaction to a participant, although I knew my sensitivity was heightened being mid-menstrual cycle. I spoke about how I could feel intimidated by high achievers and find it hard to be compassionate to those from a more privileged background. I struggled with Simon's tendency to see the male as in charge. Being able to flesh out my transferential issues around privilege and class helped. In our discussion, it became clearer that Simon was reenacting some powerful dynamics from his childhood, with a depressed, unempathic mother and a charismatic father that he wanted to emulate. Different team members had different perceptions of him, and teasing this apart helped me to understand how his spikiness and apparent contempt covered his deep vulnerability in relation to early attachment. On my next contact with him, I was able to see how difficult it was for him to tolerate his feelings. And as our rapport developed, he spoke of his feelings of disconnection, sadness, and regrets. His spikiness seemed to dissolve, and I felt increasingly warm towards him. He expressed gratitude for the opportunity to be on the trial and told us that he felt safe with us both. So yeah, that's my section from the book. And I'd just like to introduce Roberta, who will read another section from the supervision aspect. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. Yeah, so I was part of the same supervision group that Michelle has introduced to you. And I'm also going to read a vignette out. Just for a little bit of context around the vignette that I'm going to be reading, the trial that we were in was a double-blind trial, which means that half of the people were given a high dose of psilocybin and half of the people were given sort of a very low dose or a placebo dose. And this vignette is sort of the ways that this kind of uncertainty, both on the parts of the participants and, you know, the clinicians or therapists working in the trial, sort of played into kind of transferential issues and various kind of clinical situations. So the vignette is entitled, What is in the Capsule? Her story touched me, resonating with some themes of my own childhood. I felt very aware of the depths of her suffering. She spoke tearfully of her desperation for change and how devastated she would feel if the treatment didn't work. I really wanted her to benefit from it. The first dosing session was disappointing for her. We thought she'd received the low dose. She felt damaged and I felt guilty. The second session had the intensity of a high dose, bringing up feelings that oscillated between deep grief and barren emptiness. There was something very dark and distressing about her, about what I was witnessing, that left me feeling deeply worried and disconnected from her. Her depression felt like a heavy weight in our follow-up sessions. In supervision, I shared with the group my feelings of ineptitude and hopelessness. I felt poisoned after her sessions and half joked that I needed an exorcism. I realized how much my own guilt and anxiety about the darkness of her depression had pulled me into the familiar role of trying to fix things for her. I worried I had missed an important opportunity to help her work with her pain, and we discussed the pros and cons of intensification strategies for difficult feelings. We reflected on the challenges of not knowing what was in the capsules and the resonance with themes of abandonment and rejection from those participants who thought they had received the low dose. And now finally, I think I'll be passing back to Maria for the closing circle. Thank you.
Thank you all. It's been quite a journey, and it's really my honor to be closing a journey like this. And like every journey to the deep needs a proper ending, and that's not just a turning of the last page, but an ending that honors and anchors. And this is an ending that me and Tim Reid co-wrote to conclude the book. In ceremonies, retreats, and workshops, we celebrate our emergence from the chrysalis of the expanded state in a closing circle. The circle has a poignancy too. It holds its own death and rebirth. We know that this will be the ending of our time together. As we speak in the circle, we distill the essence and wisdom of our journey. As we listen, we honor the speaker with our undivided attention. We bring our full presence as we witness their pain, their ecstasy, and their flowering. Above all, the circle is a place of connection and love. As we close this book, we extend an invitation to join us in this tender, germinative place. It is a complex journey that we walk through in this work. We accompany our clients to deep places, and we go to deep places ourselves. We enjoy these beautiful moments of connection, compassion, and spirit, and we enter those darker places of disconnection, unlove, grief, and despair that have such profound healing potential when allowed to flow towards the resolution, becoming fertile soil for the new layers of growth and life. Above all, therapeutic work in expanded states departs from the model of treatment by moving towards healing. This is a fundamental paradigm shift. While treatment rests on the principles of exclusion, healing relies on the powers of inclusion. In treatment, what's seen as painful and undesirable is fragmented from the whole and treated in isolation. In healing, we follow the movements of inclusion. We honor our symptoms as messengers of the soul in service of our own unconscious depths. In the treatment paradigm, the agency is located primarily outside ourselves. It's placed upon doctors, upon pills. But in the healing paradigm, we are ourselves the primary agency and agent of change. The healing journey takes place firmly within. The psychedelic experience with intention and the right containers can facilitate such growth. And yet, as with any movement towards greater awareness and consciousness, our experiences in expanded states require our full participation. The extraordinary depth of the psychedelic experience requires skill and presence by the facilitators, as so many have said today, if we are to meet and support its healing potential. The journey ahead to bring expanded states to validation and recognition will require all of us that have witnessed the potency of such work to bring our voices to the emergent wider narratives, to break the barriers and to recognize that healing is an indispensable birthright for us all. On a collective level, as we journey into the gloaming of our moment in history, we remember that in these dark places, we may be guided by our own inner healing intelligence. That's the truest, deepest part of us. The more open we are, the more available our inner healing intelligence becomes in service of healing our collective wounds. As we accelerate our journey ahead, our capacity to be anchored to our inner wisdom will be indispensable to us all. A world that is aching requires more of us to be available as a resource for its healing processes. We can only do so by growing from a narrow self to a broader sense of self, by opening up to greater inner and outer wholeness. From this space, we come to witness our inherent interconnectedness and interdependence and recognize that to be in service of life, we need to cultivate reciprocal collaborative partnerships with the world around us. In closing, we offer our deep gratitude to everything that's brought us in this path, whether adversity or resource, for it has opened us up to truly meaningful encounters with ourselves and others. We honor the ancestors that paved the way a very long time ago, the colleagues along the way that have shared the journey with us, the clients, the students that have trusted us with their life stories and let us walk alongside them in their search for healing and purpose. We're grateful to Nir Traditions for housing this project, for housing these ideas, for housing all of us, a publisher that really believed in what we wanted to say. We have deep gratitude for all the authors that brought their incredible work and contributions to this book. We deeply respect the rigor of their work and the quality of their company. And finally, we honor you, the reader or the person that attends this event. We bow to you as we take this work into our hearts, and we hope you take it forward and sow the seeds of love. Thank you.